The Devil's Reflection. It was a rainy afternoon when Henry Mitchell walked into the flea market. The kind of grey, damp day that made the air feel heavy, like the world was holding its breath. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a little distraction from his life, which had become as dull and predictable as the weather. The divorce had done its damage, and work was nothing more than a grind. But then he saw it. A small, ornate mirror hanging crookedly on a dusty table, half hidden behind a pile of old books and vintage knickknacks. It was framed in black, intricately carved with designs that made it look older than anything Henry had ever seen. The reflection of his own face, slightly distorted by the tarnished glass, stared back at him. The vendor, a thin man with a crooked smile, noticed Henry's interest. "That's a special piece," the vendor said, his voice low and almost conspiratorial. "Came from an estate sale. They say it has powers." Henry chuckled, though the hairs on the back of his neck stood up just a little. He wasn't superstitious, but there was something about the way the vendor said it that made him pause. A stupid feeling, really, but one that stuck with him. "How much?" Henry asked, his curiosity outweighing any rational thought. $50. It wasn't much, and though he wasn't sure why, Henry felt an odd pull to the mirror, as if something or someone was urging him to take it. That night, after hauling the mirror back to his apartment, Henry cleaned it off. The black frame was beautifully detailed, and the glass, though slightly cloudy, had a certain charm to it. He hung it on the wall across from his bed, half expecting to be disappointed. But instead, he found himself staring into it for longer than usual. His own reflection looked normal, but there was something about the way the light hit it, something eerie in the stillness of the room that made his skin crawl. He shrugged it off, blaming the rainy weather and his growing restlessness. But that night, as he drifted into a fitful sleep, he dreamed of the mirror. It wasn't a dream, really, it was more like a vision. He saw himself in the reflection, but not in his apartment. He was standing in a dark alley, alone. The reflection in the mirror twisted unnaturally, his eyes wild with fear. And then, a shadow, something inhuman, long and twisted, loomed over him, its fingers reaching for his throat. Henry jerked awake, heart pounding, cold sweat sticking to his skin. He looked at the mirror, now hanging still and innocuous on the wall. The reflection was the same as always. No shadow, no nightmare. But Henry's pulse raced, and the feeling of dread hung in the air. The next few days were a blur. Henry couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. Every time he passed the mirror, his reflection seemed off, a flicker in his eyes, a movement that wasn't his. He found himself checking the mirror more and more, always expecting something different to show up. And then it did. One evening, as Henry stared at the mirror, his reflection shifted again. His own face, his real face, was still staring back at him. But his reflection was different now. It smirked. The corners of his mouth curled up in a way that made Henry's stomach turn. His reflection's eyes, those dark, familiar eyes, held a look of malice, of something sinister. The room seemed to grow colder. He felt his breath catch in his throat as the reflection grinned wider, its mouth stretching unnaturally. Then it spoke. Its voice was low growling, a sound that seemed to come from deep inside Henry's own chest. "You can't escape," it whispered. Henry recoiled, stumbling back from the mirror, his heart racing in terror. He was sweating now, his entire body trembling. He had to get rid of it. He had to. The visions came more frequently after that, each one worse than the last. Henry tried to avoid the mirror. but it was like it called to him, pulling him in. He saw himself in that alley again, his reflection standing still while he tried to run. He saw himself lying in a pool of blood, his body lifeless, eyes wide with horror, and always that shadow, always closing in, always waiting. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't think straight. His every moment was consumed by the mirror, by the grotesque future it showed him. It was as if his life wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the reflection, to whatever dark force had taken hold of it. One night, Henry couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed the mirror, his hands shaking, and threw it across the room, smashing it against the wall. He waited for the glass to shatter, to break the hold it had on him. But as the pieces fell to the floor, he saw something that froze him in place. His reflection, shattered, was still there, staring back at him from every jagged shard of glass. The reflection didn't move, but the smile, it was still there. The reflection was still alive. Days passed, but Henry's life spiraled into chaos. The visions became more real, more violent. The future the mirror showed him was becoming unavoidable. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't some supernatural force trying to trick him. It was his fate, sealed in glass. His inevitable end. He tried everything, destroying the mirror, leaving the city, even seeking help from a priest. But nothing worked. Every time he looked in a mirror, the same face, that same twisted reflection, stared back at him. And it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was real. It was waiting for him. And no matter what he did, it was already too late. Henry couldn't escape the devil's reflection. It had always been here. Henry's attempts to escape the reflection grew more desperate with each passing day. It wasn't just the mirror anymore. It was the idea of it, gnawing at him from the inside out. He'd wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced the reflection was still there, still watching. His own hands trembled as he ran them over his face, expecting to feel the cold, clammy touch of the shadow's fingers. But when he looked in the mirror, it was always him. That was the worst part. Always him. His own face, staring back, blank and unfeeling. As if it wasn't a reflection, but a mask he couldn't take off. Henry tried to ignore it, tried to carry on with his life. He went to work, ate meals, he tried to sleep. But the visions followed him, lurking in the corners of his mind, like a predator waiting to strike. They didn't fade, they didn't get better. They worsened. One evening, he found himself driving through a rainstorm, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. The windshield wipers slapped back and forth, the rhythmic motion almost hypnotic. He could feel the weight of the mirror's curse hanging over him like a shadow. It was then that he noticed it. In the rearview mirror, just behind him, there was a figure, a dark shape, slim and towering, with long, elongated limbs that seemed to stretch into the darkness. For a moment, Henry thought it was a trick of the light, the rain distorting his vision. But when he blinked, the figure was still there. Its eyes were hollow and empty, staring into him with a malevolent hunger. He slammed on the brakes, pulling off the side of the road. The rain pounded against his car, the sound deafening. His heart was pounding in his chest as he spun around, frantically searching for the thing that was following him. But there was nothing. The road was empty. No figure, no shadow. He exhaled, a shaky laugh escaping his lips. His mind was playing tricks on him. The mirror had driven him mad. But then he looked at his hands. They were shaking again. Cold. His breath came in shallow gasps, and he realized the shadow was still there. He reached into the back seat and grabbed his jacket, pulling it over his shoulders. As he did, he glanced at the rearview mirror again. But this time, it wasn't his face staring back at him. It was the reflection, the one that had been stalking him from the start. Its eyes were black bits of darkness, and its mouth stretched into a grin that could only be described as inhuman. It wasn't Henry anymore. It was something else. A twisted version of him, a reflection of everything he had feared. The smile grew wider, stretching too far, the skin around its mouth tearing in grotesque patterns. The figure in the rearview mirror slowly leaned toward the glass, as if pressing its face up against it. "You're mine now," it whispered, the words ragged and low. Henry's breath caught in his throat. His fingers slid across the dashboard, searching for the door handle, but it felt as though his body was moving in slow motion. It was happening again. The mirror. It was always with him, always pulling him into that other reality. Suddenly he snapped out of it, throwing the car into gear and speeding off, tires screeching against the wet pavement. But no matter how fast he drove, no matter how far he went, he couldn't shake the image of that reflection. It followed him everywhere, in the windows of storefronts, in puddles on the street. Even in his own eyes, he could see it. That thing. The reflection that was no longer just glass but had bled into his very soul. When he got home, he slammed the door behind him and locked it, panting heavily. The apartment was silent. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and his own breath, ragged and sharp in his ears. The mirror was still there, hanging on the wall. But now, it wasn't just an object. It had become something alive, pulsing with a terrible energy. The frame seemed to writhe, the black wood undulating as if it was breathing. Henry could feel it calling to him, pulling him toward it, urging him to look. But he couldn't look anymore. And yet, something deep inside him, some horrible compulsion, forced him to face it. He stepped forward as if against his will, his body moving like it wasn't his own. Slowly he lifted his eyes to the mirror. The surface gleamed under the dim light. But as soon as he locked his gaze on it, his heart stopped. The reflection wasn't his own. It was the twisted version, the version that had been haunting him for weeks. The shadowy figure, the one with the grin that stretched too far. Its eyes, those hollow, soulless pits, stared back at him with a knowing look. It wasn't him anymore. The reflection had consumed him. The thing in the mirror began to move. It tilted its head, its grin widening impossibly. Henry's breath hitched in his throat. He backed away from the mirror, but it was too late. The reflection was no longer confined to the glass. It was moving, reaching, extending its fingers out from the mirror, inching closer and closer. With a scream that seemed to tear his very soul apart, Henry turned and ran. But no matter where he went, no matter how fast he tried to escape, the reflection was always there, closer, reaching for him, until there was nothing left of him but the emptiness. It was the curse of the devil's reflection, and no one ever escaped it. Because once it had you, you were already gone. Henry's mind splintered. The terror was too much. The reflection, now no longer just an image but something tangible, was chasing him with relentless persistence, creeping into his every waking moment. He no longer felt like himself. The line between reality and nightmare was blurred, and he was caught in the middle, helpless. The apartment, which once felt like a safe haven, had become a prison. The walls seemed to close in on him as he stumbled through the rooms, his eyes darting from corner to corner, always fearful of seeing that thing, that reflection lurking in the shadows. He couldn't escape it. No matter how fast he moved, how far he went, It was always there, waiting in the glass, grinning, mocking him. But the worst part was when it spoke. It spoke not only in the mirror anymore, but in his mind. It whispered when he was alone, in the dark corners of his thoughts, twisting his fears. It told him that there was no way out. It was him. It always had been. The reflection had never been separate from him. It was the dark side of himself, the part of him he'd buried deep down, now emerging and claiming what it had always been owned. "You're not real," it whispered one night, the voice so clear in his head, as though it was standing right beside him. "I'm the one who was always meant to exist. You were just the illusion." Henry tried to scream, but his throat was dry, his body paralyzed by fear. His reflection had invaded his every thought, and now it was inside him, infecting his very soul. In a desperate bid for peace, Henry made a decision. He would leave the apartment. He would leave the city. He would destroy the mirror, once and for all. He grabbed his coat, his hands shaking violently, and bolted out the door. The streets were dark, wet with the rain that hadn't stopped falling for days. It felt as though the world itself was drowning, and Henry was running out of time. He needed to destroy the mirror, to rid himself of the curse. If he could just get rid of it, if he could break it, maybe, just maybe, he could escape. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't care. All he could focus on was getting away from the relentless pull of the reflection, the voice that now seemed to echo through his every thought. He couldn't live like this anymore. He couldn't live with it inside him. As he ran, the rain turned to a torrential downpour, the water streaming down in sheets. He could feel his mind slipping further, like he was drowning in his own panic. The reflection was still there, in the corners of his vision, in the puddles on the ground. Each step he took felt like it was leading him deeper into a trap. He finally reached a small, abandoned bridge over a swollen river, its rusted iron frame barely holding together. He climbed over the railing, trembling, the mirror clutched tightly in his hands. It seemed lighter now, as if it were no longer made of glass, but of something much darker, more sinister. Standing on the edge, he gazed at the reflection one last time. His face was gone. The shadow had overtaken him entirely. The thing in the glass grinned wider than ever, its eyes blacker, emptier. It wasn't him anymore. It was it. "You can't escape me," the reflection said, its voice now a guttural growl. "You belong to me." With a scream that tore through him, Henry hurled the mirror into the river. It fell with a splash, the surface of the water rippling as it sank into the dark depths below. The reflection was gone. The weight that had pressed down on him for so long was finally lifted, or so he thought. But when he turned to leave, something caught his eye. In the distance, through the pouring rain, a figure stood at the edge of the bridge, watching him. It was tall, thin, and impossibly twisted. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly blackness, and its mouth stretched wide in that same twisted grin. The reflection. It was not the mirror that had haunted him. It was within him. Always had been. The devil's reflection had never been confined to glass. It had been the darkness inside him all along, waiting for the right moment to consume him. The figure stepped closer and Henry's heart stopped as the rain seemed to fade into nothingness. There was no escape now. The reflection had taken him, body and soul. And as he stared into the abyss, he realized with a cold, terrible certainty that he was already gone. The mirror had only shown him what was always going to happen, what he he was always going to become. The devil's reflection wasn't an object. It wasn't a curse. It was his fate. The town moved on, as it always did, its daily routines carrying on without a second thought to Henry Mitchell's disappearance. The rain had stopped and the storm clouds cleared, but the darkness from that night, from the bridge, seemed to linger in the air. People went about their lives, except for the few who noticed a strange thing happening. A peculiar shift they couldn't quite explain. The mirror was gone, its shattered pieces lost to the river that night, but Henry's absence left a hole that never quite healed. There were whispers, small rumors among the townsfolk. Some swore they saw him in the corner of their vision, his face twisted in the way it had been in the mirror. Hollow eyes, that terrible grin. They'd catch glimpses of him in the reflection of shop windows or in the glass of the local diner. But when they looked again, he was always gone. It was on one of those nights, weeks after Henry's disappearance, that something truly horrific happened. Maggie Tiller, a young woman who worked at the local diner, was cleaning up the counter after closing time. The clock ticked past midnight, and the usual hum of the diner had settled into an eerie silence. She was alone, wiping down the glass panels, when she caught her reflection out of the corner of her eye. At first, it was nothing more than the familiar image of herself, her tired face, her messy hair. But as she continued wiping the glass, she saw something in the reflection. Something that wasn't there in the real one. A shadowy figure standing just behind her. Its form was tall, thin, and impossibly distorted. The grin, that same twisted, unnatural grin. Her breath caught in her throat. Maggie whipped around, but there was nothing behind her, just the empty, dimly lit diner. She turned back to the glass. It was still there, the figure, the reflection. But this time, it wasn't just standing there, it moved. The figure in the glass raised its hand, its fingers long and gnarled, and began to press them against the surface of the window. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, it began to slide them down, leaving a smear of something dark, something wet in its wake. The face in the reflection twisted, its eyes wide and hollow, its grin now stretching impossibly wide. Maggie gasped, stumbling back, knocking over a coffee mug. Her heart hammered in her chest and she tried to turn away, but her body froze. She couldn't look away. The reflection was pulling her in, drawing her closer to the glass as though it had some sort of power over her, forcing her to watch. "You're next," the figure whispered, its voice low, like a rasping wind through the trees. It wasn't just a voice. It was a feeling, a crawling sensation in her mind, wrapping around her thoughts, squeezing tighter and tighter. Before she could move, the reflection lunged forward. The glass rattled, and the entire diner seemed to shake as if something inside it was trying to break free. Maggie screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the sudden crack that split the silence. The glass of the window shattered in an instant, shards of it exploding outward. But in the very center of the broken glass, there it was, the figure. It wasn't in the reflection anymore. It was standing in front of her, its shape no longer confined to the glass. Its grin was wide, its eyes black, its skin stretched taut over its bones. It reached for her with long, cold fingers, and as it did, Maggie felt her body grow heavy, her movements sluggish, as if something was pulling her down, pulling her toward the figure. She tried to scream again, but her voice failed her. Her body refused to move. The thing's fingers brushed against her arm and it was ice cold, colder than anything she had ever felt. Maggie's vision blurred, her breath shallow and ragged, and just as she thought she might pass out, the thing whispered again, its voice like nails on glass. "He's gone," it said, "but I'm still here." The last thing Maggie saw before everything went dark was the face of Henry Mitchell, twisted in the reflection of the shattered glass. His eyes wide and empty, his grin far too wide. It wasn't Henry anymore. It wasn't anyone. It was the thing from the mirror. The next morning, the diner was found empty, abandoned. Maggie was gone, vanishing without a trace. The glass had been shattered, but there was no sign of what had caused it. The only clue left behind was a single dark smudge on the counter, a handprint, smeared in something that looked almost like blood. The police investigated, of course, but they found nothing. No signs of struggle, no evidence. It was as if Maggie had simply disappeared. But there were whispers. Whispers of a shadow following people in the streets. Whispers of the reflection. Always there, always waiting. And as the days wore on, more people began to notice strange things. The figure in the reflection, that twisted, smiling creature, started appearing in windows, in mirrors, in every surface of glass. It wasn't just in the reflection, it was real. And the whispers grew louder. They spoke of Henry Mitchell, the man who had been consumed by the devil's reflection. They said that the curse hadn't ended with him. It had spread, it had grown. Henry's face was gone, replaced by something far worse. Something that didn't need a mirror to exist. It had taken root in the town, and no one was safe. One night, years later, a new family moved into Henry's old apartment. They didn't know the history, the dark secret the walls held. They hung their own mirror on the wall, just as Henry had done, never thinking twice about it. And when they looked into the glass, they would see nothing unusual, nothing at all, except perhaps the faintest shadow standing behind them, waiting, grinning, always grinning. And if they were unlucky enough to stare too long, to look into the reflection for just a bit too long, they might hear something, a whisper, "You're mine now." And as they turned to flee, as they ran from the mirror, they would catch one last glimpse of a figure in the glass. The same twisted grin. It was Henry Mitchell, or at least what he had become. And it was too late to escape. The curse had never left. It had never been just a reflection. The town had long since fallen silent, its residents too afraid to speak of the things they saw late at night in the corner of their eyes, or in the quiet reflections of their own homes. They spoke in hushed whispers, and the few who remained in Henry's old apartment moved out within weeks. The fear had spread like a sickness, a contagion that couldn't be cured. The cursed reflection had taken hold, and no one could escape it. And so, life in the town carried on. But it was different now. Every mirror, every window, every sheet of glass had become a silent witness to something monstrous. People went about their daily routines, but the knowledge that the curse was never truly gone gnawed at the back of their minds. Every glance at their own reflection, every passing shadow brought with it the dread of what might lurk just beyond the glass. But it wasn't the reflection itself that was the true horror. It was the realization that you were never alone, not even when you were by yourself. The thing in the glass was not an illusion. It wasn't confined to the mirror. It was always there, just waiting for the moment when you least expected it. And when that moment came, you would see it. And when you saw it, it would be too late. Years passed, and the town changed. New generations moved in, unaware of the horrors that once plagued the old streets. The buildings were renovated, the roads repaired, and the whispers of the devil's reflection became little more than old legends, fading from memory like forgotten dreams. But there were still those who remembered. And those who remembered, they knew the truth. They knew the curse hadn't ended. It had just been buried under layers of time and silence, like a smoldering ember, waiting to catch fire once again. It was in the quiet, forgotten corners of the town that the reflection still waited, lurking in mirrors, in windows, in puddles on rainy nights. It was there, patient and hungry, just as it had always been. And eventually, it would find a new soul to claim. It was only a matter of time. On a stormy night, a man named Samuel Weaver moved into Henry Mitchell's old apartment. He was new to the town, just looking for a place to start fresh. The apartment had a certain charm, its vintage feel appealing to him in a way he couldn't quite explain. It was cheap too, which made it even more attractive. But as he unpacked, setting up the last of his belongings, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was an unease in the air, a quiet whisper that followed him from room to room. The reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed to flicker whenever he glanced away. He told himself it was just the lighting, the age of the apartment. Nothing to worry about. But then, one evening, as he brushed his teeth, he felt it, cold, like a breath on the back of his neck. He glanced into the mirror, half expecting the flickering shadow to appear again. This time, though, it was different. This time he saw something move in the reflection. It wasn't his own face anymore. It was something else. A tall, thin figure with hollow, dark eyes. A twisted grin stretching far too wide. It was there, watching him. For a moment, Samuel froze, unable to look away. His pulse raced in his throat, and his breath caught in his chest. The figure leaned closer in the mirror, its features sharp and grotesque, its smile widening as if it could feel Samuel's fear. "You're mine now," it whispered. Samuel's heart pounded, and he stumbled back from the sink. But the figure didn't disappear. It stayed there, grinning, as if it were waiting for him. Samuel's legs turned to jelly as he backed away. He reached for the door, his hands trembling. But before he could escape, the reflection spoke again. "You're too late." And Samuel knew, as he ran from the apartment and into the stormy night, that the curse had claimed him. It wasn't just in the mirror. It was inside him, twisting and coiling around his soul, feeding on his fear, until there was nothing left of him but that same twisted smile. In the town, life went on. People came and went, unaware of the curse that had never truly left. They moved into Henry Mitchell's old apartment, only to vanish without a trace. And each time the reflection would be there, waiting. The thing in the glass, always growing, always feeding. The devil's reflection had never been confined to the past. It had never been just a story. It was alive. It was real. And as the storm clouds gathered over the town once again, it became clear the curse would never end. Because in the end, there was no escaping the devil's reflection. It was already too late.